All right, thank you everyone. So yeah, I'm Marcus, I'm a senior sales engineer at Jamf. You may hear me on podcasts or other things, but what I'm going to talk about today is a bit of a quandary that a lot of people go through about, whether to let users be a local administrator or not. And it's something that, the discussions around it sometimes draw parallels to many other struggles, maybe between two different ideologies. Can be perceived as good versus evil, but how do you work out who's good and how's evil? Like, both sides have got really alluring benefits, and both sides insist that they're the one true way. So, firstly, any references to science fiction are entirely based on these 1980s Turkish action figures. I'm not sure where they got the idea for these. Maybe somebody else might know. I'm definitely not referencing any other science fiction sagas, especially those with large, experienced legal teams. But I do think that using misguided bootleg action figures as a model for training AI to create images for a conference presentation is way more sensible than trying to copy something beautiful like Studio Ghibli or something like that, something considered, where a lot of effort has gone into, making things perfect. So instead, I've chosen something else. The A in AI here is definitely not going to stand for art, and you won't be seeing any art in these slides. So let's get started. So I'm going to break the discussion down into these sections. Like, why do we even care about this? We don't have enough time to go down the rabbit hole of everything in 30 minutes, but I will have some references at the end and a QR code so you can find some of the things that I found insightful while I was looking at this. So why do we even have this question that we want to ask? Why do we care if someone's a local administrator? So Mac OS is different to other Apple operating systems. So we've got, iOS, iPadOS, visionOS, watchOS. They're predominantly single-user operating systems. So Mac OS has its foundations in NextOS and Unix. So that's got the concept of multiple users with different roles and rights. So that's why this is very important in Mac OS. So let's have a look at Apple's definition of this. So starting with the administrator, by default, it's the first account created on the Mac. Depends, we can change that if we're managing it. But the three call-outs they have is that it can add and manage additional user accounts. It can install applications, and it can change settings. So yeah, these are three things we probably want to have a little bit of control around in our environments, right? So let's look at the standard user. So the first comment is clearly aimed at a consumer context, but yet in managed environments, it's also technically true, which is the best kind of true. You have to have at least one local administrator on a Mac. It can be created by the device management service, and it can be hidden from the end user, which can be a standard user that maybe appears to them that it's the first account on the device. So let's have a look at the three items compared to administrator. So it can still install apps. The Mac App Store, or apps installed in locations that don't require admin credentials, like dragging an app bundle onto the desktop or in the applications folder in the user account, and it can change settings, but only settings that impact its own account and not those of other accounts. That's a really important consideration. And it's not able to add or modify other user accounts. So let's dig a little bit deeper into those. Software. Why do we want to control what software people are using? There may be licensing impact. So things like Java, if you've got users that are just installing any version of Java that they feel comfortable using on their machine, there may actually be financial implications for the company. Docker is another application like that. Managing your SaaS spend, you want to sort of control which applications people are using, which are ones that are licensed. Then we're looking at data governance or provenance, so file synchronizing applications like Google Drive, Dropbox, things like that. You've got to be careful about where your PI, your IP or your PII is going on these devices. And then there's a new paradigm of data governance where if they're using AI tools, LLMs, like what is that doing with the data on their device? Is it sending it somewhere else? Is it training models on things? But we also want to make sure that we're not introducing inadvertently malware into our systems. But then there's also consistency. You want to make sure that everybody is using the software that's been decided to be used in that organisation. You may not want them introducing other software and then expecting you to support that software. You may not want to introduce software that's going to cause compatibility issues that hasn't been tested in your environment. So what about the user accounts? So this is important for good management controls as to how that user account appears, whether it's an administrator or a standard user like we're talking about here. So how many folks have had to deal with users creating, maybe a personal account on the device? Oh, this is the one I use for other stuff that's not work-related. Some organisations are totally fine with that. Other organisations may not be. Who's also seen an additional account appear on a device that the name is not necessarily the name of the person who's been allocated that device? I can see some smiles there, like, oh, this is the one that my kid takes to school, or I gave this to, like, okay, right? Or, maybe it's been given to a different user at the organisation. Oh, we've got Bob that's starting tomorrow, and getting IT to get them a new device is always, we didn't want to bother you with that, so we had this other one here, and we just created an account on it and gave it to them, so you don't need to worry. We want to make sure that the proper offboarding, onboarding workflows are covered. So usually the most important consideration is changes to the system. So why do we care about this? We want to make sure that people are adhering to the security controls that we have in the organisation. It may be shared machines in a lab situation where you don't want user A using a device and making changes that they think are what they want to do, logging out, and then somebody else having to deal with a device operating in a different way. But it also comes back to that ease of support, where if you have a known baseline configuration of a device, then you can plan and resource your support and provide documentation around this is how our devices should be, having these known configurations and testing compatibility. We don't release new configurations, like new operating systems, until we've gone through all of that testing. So, speaking of security controls, so a lot of time people will decide to enforce a standard user role to comply with a security benchmark, a framework, or some other kind of regulatory standard. So we can see a few here that people are regularly using. So Essential 8 makes reference to not running as a local administrator, and also calls out that temporary elevation is not considered a control. We know this is Windows-centric, the way the Essential 8 has been written, and you'll see this on some of these other standards as well, where they're often talking about an administrator account being a domain administrator account, or administrator of things outside of that machine. As we heard earlier from Apple, essentially ACSC's modern defensible architecture refers to least privileged. So you give the user the ability to do the things they need to do and nothing more. It doesn't say specifically what those privileges should be. So CIS level 1 and 2 are also other controls we see fairly consistently applied out there. They do not have any reference at all as to whether you should be a local administrator or not in those benchmarks. Lots of other controls, but nothing stipulating that. The CIS controls document does, however, recommend using a separate account that you use for performing administrator activities. NIST 853 is another really well-used configuration benchmark. Again, no recommendation to be a standard user on that, but there are other NIST publications like 800-171 that once again tells us to use a least privileged approach to accounts. UK Cyber Essentials Plus is another one that's fairly arduous, but if you're operating in Europe, you may be expected to implement this. This also recommends users needing admin rights have to have a second account on the device that they use. But It's worth knowing that there are several very large organisations who have managed to achieve this certification at scale with a lot of risk by demonstrating controls around a local administrator account, the user's running as local administrator, and show that the built-in controls and the way they've configured it mitigates the risk, and they've achieved this certification. So what are the things that are good and bad with the different approaches? So let's start with making everyone a standard user, which is what we hear a lot of people wanting to do. So, you know, the benefit of this is consistency. You can set the baseline configuration and know that the devices are effectively going to stick to that. Users are less likely to make changes that are going to stop other things from working. The problem of, I installed this VPN I heard about on TikTok that lets me watch overseas television really easily, and now I can't print or whatever, or I absolutely have to use this artisanal web browser because it allows me to set my own custom proxy. Like, those things just don't happen. And new features can be tested before you're expected to support them. You can make sure that everything works, everything's compliant, people are going to be able to do their job. However, anything they needed admin rights to be able to do on the machine is now your job to do. So I speak to a lot of prospects who are new to managing Macs, and their first question is, oh, will Jamf let me make all my users standard and take away admin rights? Absolutely. But the context is that now you need to automate all of those things that the users needed to do. So are you resourced to be able to deliver that? You know, if they're not going to be able to install printers, they're not going to be able to remove, unused network SSIDs, all of these sorts of things, you need to be able to build the automation to do the things the users need to do. What's the SLA you've got around that? So if someone needs a new application, what does the process look like for them requesting it, testing it, being approved and delivered, compared to them being able to use their own better judgment, install that themselves? And then we come to updating it. What about applications that maybe have been developed in a way that they assume that all the users are local administrator, and sometimes trying to use those as a standard user is just not going to be a good experience. What about discovery? How do you even find out what users are needing on their machines if their machines aren't able to change? How do you actually find out what they'd like to be able to do on the machines? So which users are most likely to have problems with a decision like this? It's the admin's best friend, isn't it? Most of the things that we may be trying to block is actually them trying to do their job. We don't want you running unapproved applications in your environment. Well, what about this application that I'm developing for our company, which helps pay all of our salaries? I need this new binary that's going to allow me to simplify some code or make a workflow infinitely more efficient. Or I've got a developer pipeline that just needs sudo. So this is where we see people wanting to be administrators. They've got the freedom to do whatever they need to do their job and use their Mac in a way that works for them. They don't need to create IT tickets and wait for things they can just do themselves. But there's a lack of control where what they think is the right way of doing things may not be what their manager or other areas of the organisation or the security team thinks is the right way of doing it. And there's a risk that they may be introducing malicious software or code. And then we're back to supporting the devices in the unknown state, where you have no idea how this machine has been configured or what it's running, or even what some of these applications are that you're having to support. But there's another way. So the hybrid approach is to let the user just have just-in-time elevation, so they can access being an administrator when they need it, and don't have the risk of being an administrator all the time. So anything that needs admin credentials is now a deliberate and considered event, and you can combine this with an acceptable use policy, so users are aware of the fact that they need to use that wisely. And not everybody has to have access. You can be granted on request. You need to be a member of a certain group. There are going to be a lot of roles out there that may have no need for this, and so you can have that policy for them. And it can be taken away when it's not needed. If nobody is elevating, maybe they don't actually need it. You've done a really good job of automating what they need. But the other side of that is, are you actually making anything different? Temporary elevation still allows users to do pretty much everything they could do as a full-time administrator, but you're just getting in their way, you're making them jump through hoops to do their job, or they might just keep elevating all day to get around these controls, or even just elevating once and creating a sneaky little admin account, which means they're complying with some of those regulatory frameworks by having a second account that they just use when they elevate. We'll get to some of these later. So what are some of the tools that we can use to manage this in our environment, sort of the different ways that we want to do things? So starting at the beginning, we can manage the kind of account that is created on the device at the setup assistant using MDM. So in Jamf, in your computer pre-stage settings, importantly, you have to create an MDM managed administrator first, because there has to be an admin on the device. It's probably a good idea to randomize the password on that, or use something like LAP so you don't have a consistent admin account on all the machines. But once you have that account on there, you can now enforce that the account created at the setup assistant is a standard account. But it looks like it's just the standard out-of-box experience. Let's not forget AD binding. You can ensure users are not local admins, and you can grant members of a specified directory, group, local admin rights over the Mac when they log in. They can also get administrative rights even if they aren't logged in and don't have an account. But please don't do this. Unless you've got very specific requirements, there are much more modern ways of achieving this now. So Jamf Connect, now part of Jamf for Mac, Business Plan, Jamf for K-12, but still available a la carte. You can create users, admin or standard, using their cloud identity provider credentials, and ensure that they stay that way. And you can add things like MFA in there at the login window. So all done using your cloud identity provider, Entra ID, Okta, Google, Ping, all of these sorts of things. There are lots of commercial tools out there that do this. So Kanji's Passport, Adigy Identity, Mosile Auth, Xcode. There's a bunch of solutions out here that do this. It's also got the capability to temporarily elevate users to local administrator, now delivered through Self-Service Plus application, or even in the menu bar. So identity provider authentication to make sure they're in the right group and they are who they say they are. You can require the users to state a reason of why they needed to use the admin rights. It's timed with automatic demotion, and you can control how many times they can elevate. Or you may just want to use local biometrics, where you just want to make sure that the person using the device is the person who's elevating. And this is all logged along with timestamps of when the elevation and demotion took place, so you can audit that against what changed on the device to get a better idea as to whether they were doing what they said they were doing, or even give you that opportunity to provide automations. You can see things that people are needing admin rights for and may be able to eliminate the need to elevate for that in the future, and a command line interface. Importantly, this functionality doesn't need to be deployed alongside the account creation and password sync capabilities of Jamf Connect. So if your organisation isn't using those, that you're using a passwordless phishing-resistant solution like Platform Single Sign-On Secure Enclave, you can still use the elevation component of this alongside that. SAP Privileges, another tool many folks are using. Lovely to have Robert here from SAP. Open source, so you can fork this and add functionality in there yourself if the tool doesn't have the things you need. Collaboration like that can introduce new features. Currently, no identity provider integration, but it does integrate with Touch ID. Once again, there are a bunch of commercial solutions out there. Here's a couple of them. I'm sure there's plenty more out there. Platform single sign-on is definitely the new hotness, and it's really good to see Apple embracing cloud identity right in the operating system. Currently, as of Sequoia, it only has the ability to create additional user accounts, not the first account, if you're using password sync or smart card. But in Tahoe, I don't know, I'm really excited about identity providers implementing the new setup assistant workflow where you can leverage that identity and end up at the desktop, whether you're synchronizing passwords or using secure enclave. This is interesting. It's really worth noting that Apple's spec for platform single sign-on does include the ability to assign authorization to users based on identity provider groups, so that it'll allow a standard user to be able to have access to certain things you would need administrator credentials for based on group membership. None of the identity providers have implemented this yet. So interesting to see what happens there. There's also a whole bunch of scripted solutions out there that people have been using for years. So one of my favorites is this make me an admin script in Jamf's GitHub repo, not just because of the functionality, but because I get to see this guy every time I visit the repo. Miss you, Charles. There's also scripts in there for adding capabilities like the ability to add printers or use Xcode without needing full admin rights. So what are some of the justifications we see with organisations for admin or not, which just aren't really relevant in 2025? So this is one of the main ones I hear over and over again. We need users to be standard users because we don't want them to install applications. So we saw that in Apple's documentation, that even a standard user can install certain applications under certain circumstances. And it's not just dragging app bundles into the desktop or running them from within the user's applications folder. It can be from within a DMG in their downloads folder. It can be from attached external storage or all sorts of things. Standard users can't install packages, but there are ways that people can get around this. So understanding that just by making someone a standard user is not achieving that sort of application control in your environment. So we don't want them to modify system files. So what exactly is meant by modifying the system? I remember when system integrity protection came in, Mac admins were wailing and gnashing their teeth that we're not able to modify the things that we wanted to modify. And that was our sort of first experience of the way Apple was taking things. Then we lost kernel extensions. And so that also removed so many wonderful opportunities for us or software we're deploying to damage the operating system. So we can see the ability to modify the system is going away. And then we ended up with a sealed system volume. Almost entirely eliminates that risk of damaging the system because it's a read-only snapshot. The idea of Unix and what a root user is able to do. A local administrator in macOS is able to do effectively the same things as the root user. The root user cannot modify any of these things. So there's no danger to any of this. We just need to worry about the settings that they're changing. So what can we do about that? So declarative device management has got some really cool tools we can use here. So the first one is service configuration files. That allows us to manage things like SSH, cups, Apache, C shell, bash, or the sudo as file, but have all of the configurations being immutable and protected by system integrity protection. Remember that thing that we didn't like when it came in? All of a sudden it's our friend now. We can use this to stop people from changing things. Even an admin user can't change them. So an example here, we've got a service configuration file we've deployed using a Jamf blueprint. So this is a sudo as file, which is hosted in a zip file. And that's able to place restrictions on what admin users are able to do with the sudo as command. It's not carte blanche. You can actually be able to modify and dictate what they can and cannot do and how they're able to use it. So in here, we've got a restriction on using system setup. And also in there is also a restriction on using the RM command, which I'm sure your users will love. But this is an example. So macOS downloads it and it places it in a SIP protected location. So based on this, we can see that the user is not able to use the system setup command anymore. So we can allow someone to be a local administrator on the machine, and if we know the things we're not wanting them to do, which is why we may not want them to be a local administrator, we now have tools that will allow us to very efficiently prevent those things from happening on the machine. They can no longer perform risky or protected actions. And then there's also the services background task declaration as well. So this allows you to create immutable launch D items. So launch agents or launch daemons that an admin user now can't unload or modify or remove. So you think about those two items there that are the first ones we received, and the possibilities are pretty awesome as to what you can do in your system to allow people to do what they need to do, but not be able to do the things that you don't want them to do. So this is why it's really important that your security team have access to macOS specific information so that they can understand, audit, and respond to things that are going on the machines for both administrators and also for users who are standard to know what they're doing on their device. So there's some really good resources out there for security teams to understand how macOS operates. Patrick Wardle's Objective by the Sea conference and all the presentations is just some of them there. So what sort of tools do we have to understand what the users are doing with their admin rights, whether they've got permanent rights, temporary or no admin rights? It's important to actually have that visibility to know what's going on the machine. So Apple have got two frameworks that will really help you understand what's happening without causing huge performance hits like you might see if you're using other methods of capturing the information. So unified logs gives a really verbose output of what's happening on the system. And then we've got the endpoint security APIs that give us access to data that we'd previously use kernel extension or audit D or things like that to access that information. So at Jamf, we've really embraced this as well, using these really awesome tools Apple's given us. So we've got a telemetry stream we can give you of information that you can send to your SIEM where you can analyze it. And so the telemetry stream is using that endpoint security API to give you sort of a curated list of really useful information. And then you can supplement that with things that you filter out of the unified logs. So you could use this information to look for applications that are running out of non-standard locations, whether it be from /volumes, /temp, from /users, from in the users folder. You can also detect applications that are running that maybe weren't deployed by your management tool. You can detect users getting added, removed, and modified, and you can see who created that user account, how they created it, and when they created it. So you can take appropriate action on that. So sometimes there needs to be repercussions for users who break those acceptable use policies. There's no point in having a policy if you're not going to take action on when that policy has been broken. So it's really important to understand that not all of the controls need to be technical. There are going to be some times when it is not going to be IT's job to deal with this. Maybe their job to find out about it and report on it, and then let managers deal with what happens next. So a good way to summarise all of this is to think about what's right for your environment. What works somewhere else shouldn't dictate what you do, because you may have different regulations you need to adhere to. You may have different resources available to you. You may be an organisation that's got a large client platform engineering team of really skilled people who can respond quickly to everything that anyone in their organisation may need. Or you may just be one person who is not just managing the devices. But have you got stakeholder buy-in? If they're looking at the way they're reading a framework like Essential 8 and you're trying to show that there is a way you can achieve that by doing it differently, if they're not interested in listening to what you have to say, then that may be something that's not going to be easy to solve. And maybe you want to try solving some other problems first. Can you do it without compromising the user's ability to do their job? That's the reason why they have these computers that you give them, is to do their job. If what you're doing is stopping them from doing their job, is there a better way to do it? So as I said, there's a whole bunch of really awesome tools out there that and here's some links to them that go into lots of detail about some of these concepts, some of the frameworks, and some of the new workflows that you can use. Does anybody have any questions?
The configuration you were showing with declarative for managing sudo, does that also impact what commands Jamf can run? Like, say, if it needs to stop, or you have put in the configuration to stop RM, can Jamf still do RM?
Because we're not technically sudoing to do things. It depends.
Short answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you try hard enough, you could probably get it to...
Yeah, follow on.
Yeah.
Would a user then be able to do those same commands in the way that Jamf is doing them to bypass those controls?
If they were root, sure.
Yeah. So you may want to stop them from switching to be root. Yeah. Yeah.
Sure.
So to answer that there, so the way Jamf would run it, if you went into a policy and you said, you don't have to type sudo into the Jamf command, right? It's just going to run because it's executing within root. If an end user was able to go log in as root, which root account is disabled by default, then yes, they could in theory, but you would hopefully have remediated that beforehand.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's those things around the sudo as file as anything that would be presented after a sudo command. So sudo hello or sudo say commands would be allowed or not allowed.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Cool. Yeah, and definitely restricting the ability to switch to the root account would be something you would want to do. But like everything, test to make sure also that you're not stopping people from doing their job as well. You will discover particular developers that have a need to do things. Any other questions? Yep.
Thank you. I said I was going to have a question for you. So I get the developers side of things and giving them the option to have admin rights. Are you seeing any other class of users where it's the norm or desirable for them to have it?
Depends. Often it's organisations. It really is organisations making choices that what are the things they're trying to stop people from doing rather than it being the default and we're doing it because it's the way we've always done it. We see a lot of security teams saying we need to cut down on this. What I'm seeing a trend is of more people wanting to get away from carte blanche administrator rights. And I think it's an opportunity to educate them as there are different ways of achieving that. One is absolutely making people standard users, and if that's the right thing to do, then that's the right thing to do. But there's also other steps they can take along on the journey. Audio engineers are people that often have lots of very complex things they need to do, but yeah, primarily developers. Jamf admins are another one. We don't let anyone have admin rights in the organisation, but you have admin rights, don't you? Well, I'm special. But, you know, when you make the policy, you can make the policy whatever you want. But no, like, is anybody else seeing any other particular sort of personas that are needing admin rights? It is predominantly developers.
Yeah, audio stuff.
Yeah, developers and audio. Anybody seeing any other personas that people with a C in front of their title often want it, but they're often the people where you want to have tighter controls of, they're a much more attractive target for things.
So system administrators,
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And that's always been an approach I've tried to take is why would I inflict something on other people that I'm not prepared to do myself? Oh, but I can't do my job. Well, have I thought about what it's like to do somebody else's job? Yeah, exactly. really what I'm trying to get through is that there's a lot more to this, which means it needs to be a longer and more detailed discussion and consideration rather than just one or the other. It depends is my favourite answer. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. Oh, big hand.